back to Love Miss Drop Stitch. I hope you've all been enjoying the latest series, which has been dyeing your own clothes. I've been doing this personally in an attempt to be more sustainable and save money as well, so you could dye clothes that you've kind of fallen out with and want a bit of rejuvenation, zhuzh them up a bit, or I've been buying them second hand off vintage, some new with tags in as well. I've been buying white clothes, but we'll talk about in a moment if the clothes have to be white for you to dye. I've done quite a few videos on this, how to do them by machine, by hand, and an ombre dip dye as well. And I'm not sure if I'll put it out before or after this video, but I've done another on kind of my experiments and fails and how that went. There's also a blog post about this video in case you want everything kind of in a nice chronological order, and there'll be a bit more explanation and pictures as well. This video is no nonsense, everything you need to know before you start dyeing your own clothes, so let's jump in. The first one is use the correct dye for your fabric, and by this we mean, is your fabric natural fibres or is your fabric synthetic? Dye I can get in the shops in the UK is called Dylan. I've used that for most of them actually, but I've got rid of the packaging, and on one occasion I used Rit dye. This is an American brand. It's a bit more expensive because the imports, but if you're in another country you might find this or other ones that are local to your country as well. But the main take home is they were all for dyeing natural fibres, and by that we mean cotton, linen, viscose, rayon, wool, silks, synthetic fibres. You need a different dye, so the dye will attach to those molecules, and by that we mean, you know, polyesters, nylon. If I show you this here, then the buttons that are plastic haven't dyed, and that's because I used a dye for natural fibres, so it didn't stick to the synthetic fibres. Another example is here, it hasn't stuck to the elastic or the polyester overlocking thread because I used a dye for natural fibres. Let's have a hat trick. Okay, this turned out to be a fail and a lot lighter than the intended colour. That's the colour it should have been, because it was actually, and I didn't realise, 85% polyester, 15% cotton. So here's the general advice from the internet. If it's 35% synthetics, so polyester or less, you can use dye for natural fibres. Just bear in mind that it might come out lighter, well it will, and not the kind of full saturated that it shows on the bottle. If your composition's more than 35% synthetics, polyester, then you need to use a dye for synthetic fabrics. Essentially, we want the dye to stick to the most molecules, so dyes for natural fabrics will stick to natural fibres, and conversely, dyes for synthetic fabrics stick to the synthetic fibres. So we want it to stick to what's mostly there. There are three main methods of dyeing. So method number one is dyeing by hand. I've put all the pros and cons on the website blog post as well, but just a couple to give you now. Yeah, it's convenient. However, if you're dyeing quite a few things, because of the time you need to attend to it stirring and letting it sit and all that and keep going back to it, it can take quite a while. So for example, I was doing 3 garments and it took me like 3.5, 4 hours to do them. But if you're just doing kind of one-off item, or you're happy to spend the time, then great, absolutely fine. Method number two is dyeing by machine. You can put in and follow the instructions for kind of, this is a liquid dye. I just bought a Dylon purpose machine dye. And what that meant is I just undid the packaging, put it in, put the washer on and left it. I suppose the downside of that is it takes quite a while in a hot wash, so it might be more expensive to do. A good thing about it that I like though is you can dye more fabric. So with the hand dye, it would only let me do up to 250 grams, but with the machine dye, it was up to 650 grams. So that's the difference between kind of doing a t-shirt or a dress. Again, do look at the instructions on it and if it's for natural or synthetic fibres. Number three, this is the one I avoided like the plague, but I am looking forward to hearing if you've ever used this method. It's the stovetop method. And this is why I went to the more natural fibre side of things, because it seemed easier to dye. So for the synthetic dyes that I saw that I could get in my country, it wanted me to use a lot of heat, and kind of that method was the stovetop method. So I just didn't want to go out and buy a pan. Remember, all the stuff you're using, it's having dye on it, so don't use anything that you'd use for food. So I didn't want to have that and then just store this massive crock pot for no reason. and it takes quite a lot of heat and energy to do, so it just wasn't a method that was practical for me. But I have done it in the past for dyeing wool actually. I'm not sure how big of a pot you'd need even for doing something like, you know, a big dress. But yeah, the three main methods for dyeing your clothes: by hand, by machine, and the stovetop method. Next up, does it have to be white fabric? Well, no. White is the easiest to dye because it's a blank canvas. You can actually get, but they're quite expensive, about £8 or something, like specialist liquids, and the dye brands will do them themselves. I know the Rit dye definitely do them. This brand here, nothing sponsored. And this strips out kind of any existing colour in it. Not sure how effective it would be, whether it would turn it, you know, bleach white, or if it would just be more of a faded version. From that, you need to bear in mind that any colour present will affect the overall outcome. A nice, safe example is dyeing a pair of jeans to refresh them. So if you've got blue jeans and you use a jean blue dye, which some of them are called, then that's going to refresh them, and it's already got the colour underneath. Nothing's going to kind of clash or mingle. For any other colours, you need to follow the colour theories, the colour wheel. So if you've got blue jeans and red dye, they're going to look purple. So that's the take-home message. If you're dyeing it the same colour, easy, happy days, it will come out a version of that colour. If you're dyeing from white, that's great, a blank canvas. Absolutely possible to dye something a different colour to what it is, just bear in mind kind of basic colour theory principles as well. I would love to see examples if anyone's been confident enough to do that as well. Next up is wet fabric. It should say on your instructions, and this might sound a bit bizarre, but let me explain. Dye molecules stick better to wet fabric than dry fabric. So all you need to do, whether this is any of the three methods, so for me it was before doing it by hand or by machine, I'd put it under the tap, get it wet, and then squeeze it out so it's damp. So you don't need it sopping wet. And then the dye molecules will stick better to it. As promised, we'll discuss the tools you need, in this case for hand dyeing. If I say so rather ingeniously, thought of using a foot spar bowl. Why did I do this? Well, I didn't want the dye to touch anything that food would touch, so I didn't want it touching the sink, washing up bowl, etc. And because I was using dye for natural fibres, it did not dye the football at all, and I promise I've had every colour under the sun in here and it's still great to use again. What I used for stirring the fabric, I used quilting ruler that I'm not precious about, and it's perfectly fine to use again. Remember, if you're using dye for synthetic fabrics, then it will stain, you know, whatever's a synthetic molecule. For powdered dye, I needed to make a little dye bath first, so I used a strawberry pot with no holes in. Other things you could use, ice cream, well, given this weather now, ice cream, tubs, anything without holes and that you're not going to use again for food. So that's why I didn't want to use a measuring jug. And my mum has like 1 kilogram of Greek yogurt a week, so then big tubs will be good for that as well. I used a little pastry brush to get the salt from in between the knobbly bobbly bits, and more on that on the website as well. And speaking of salt, this seems a strange one, but is probably the biggest thing you need to know and not forget before you start dyeing. Salt acts as a fixative, a bit like if you know about dyeing wool, you need to use citric acid or vinegar, and that's also a fixative. Essentially, salt helps the dye molecules to stick and stay, and that's what we call something being colour fast. So when I wash these in the washing machine again, the dye won't all come out and it won't fade quickly, essentially. So, sorry, there's just a plane disrupting this video coming over. We don't want the dye to wash off as quickly as we put it on. So salt's a good fixative. It's a good fixative for the natural fibres of cotton, linen, viscose rayon. If, interestingly, you're using wool or silks, then use a white vinegar as the fixative. But otherwise, just normal table salt, and that's why I really like this project, because for once it is things that you can find in your home or easily in the shops. Last but not least, does it stain? Well, as we've talked about a bit, if you're using a dye for natural fibres, then it won't stain things that are synthetic, so this plastic ball. However, when I did the washing machine ones, it did stain the seal a little bit. I'm not entirely sure why, and when I put the sponge in, dye did come off as well, and that's the one that I was like crime scene meticulous trying to clean so my mum wouldn't have a million questions, but somehow she came home and knew that I'd been dyeing clothes, and somehow she managed to find dye as well where I'd not quite caught it. So yeah, I would give the washing machine kind of a 15-minute, 30-minute run afterwards, just with nothing in, to get any excess dye out. Other answers to does it stain? Yes, I was literally going around saying caught red-handed for quite a while when I'd been using red dye. Well, natural fibres, isn't it? So yeah, it did stain my skin. It came off after about 24 hours. Where it didn't come off was kind of the cuticle area on my nail. That was a nice shade of purple. Worktop, it didn't stain, and I could just get any dye bits off with a sponge after not a vigorous scrub, just a mild one. Where it did stain was the walls. Somehow, it must have been when even though I'd kind of spun it and rinsed off the dye, it must have been when I flung it over the door to dry the dress. It somehow got black dye on the walls. I didn't notice, my mum did. Well, that's all for today, folks. I can't wait to see any of your creations, and let me know in the comments if you've ever dyed your own clothes and share any advice as well, or if you will be dyeing your own clothes to try and be more sustainable and save money. As always, do give us a like, thumbs up, subscribe, all that good stuff. It really does help us. Thank you and take good care.